Thank you very much, Tim, and good morning, everyone. And it's such a privilege to be here. My name is Israel Olofinjana, and I'm from Nigeria. And I'm one of those people that came as a missionary to the UK. So my mission context is the UK. And I'm going to unpack that with the 20 minutes that I've got. But I think it's just important just to say a little bit about myself before going into what I'm talking about, because that will help to elucidate more of some of the perspectives that I might share with us this morning. So I currently serve with the Evangelical Alliance, and I serve as one of the directors, meaning I sit on the senior leadership team, leading something called One People Commission. And the idea of One People Commission is working with the diaspora church leaders across the UK. So I get the privilege to work with the Chinese church leaders, South Asian church leaders, South Korean church leaders, African church leaders, African Caribbean church leaders, and Latin American church leaders. So it's quite an exciting project and initiative that we've got. Started in 2012, and the network has grown. Even at the moment, we're attracting some Eastern European church leaders in that sense. So it brings together the breadth and depth of British Christianity, or an expression of that multi-ethnic flavor of the church. So it's important to start, I suppose my talk, I want to put it into two perspectives. One is sort of my studying theology in Nigeria, and then, of course, studying in the UK, and some of my reflections to help us with some of the questions we are wrestling with today. If I were to put my own definition on theology, my definition of theology would be, it's about our questions about God, about who we are, and about our world. And so if we start with that, when I became a Christian, I became very passionate about ministry. Immediately I knew I wanted to serve and be a pastor. I wanted to be a church leader. That was what I sensed at that time. I was age 17 when I became a Christian. So one of the key questions I started wrestling with is, what do I need to do? What do I need to study in order to be an effective pastor? And I remember when I did some certificate course in ministry, one of the lecturers, my pastor, said something about anyone who wants to understand the Bible better need to study Greek and Hebrew. So I thought, okay, I'm going to go to the university and look for a course that has Greek and Hebrew, because I wanted to understand the biblical text more. So it was a discipleship question that started for me. How can I get to know the Bible more in order to be effective as a pastor, as a leader in that sense? So I went to theological college, or I went to university to do religious studies, focusing on Greek and Hebrew biblical studies. So I did New Testament Greek for about 4 years, and did biblical Hebrew for about 3 years in order to be able to master the language, and I was very excited about that. Alongside that, because I love church history, I delve into a lot of church history as well. And something began to happen as I began to study church history. I realized that most of the textbooks I was reading was written mainly by white Western Europeans. And that led to a question for me. Why is that so? That I was studying in Nigeria, but many of the textbooks I was reading and the core texts were written by white Western European. I was wrestling with that question. And as I was wrestling with that question, I was exposed to African church history. I realized that actually African church history has a lot of characters and a lot of things to teach. I started realizing that actually many of the church fathers that we talk about were Africans. Many of them were Asian. So I started to realize that Augustine, for example, was African. Tertullian, the man that coined our word of Trinity, which we now talk about Trinitarian theology, was African. The first exegetes, the first people who interpreted scriptures or begin to put a theological method to how we interpret the Bible, were Africans. Clement of Alexandria, Origen of Alexandria, Athanasius, another bishop from Alexandria. So as I started to study this, my question even increased around the fact that, so if there is so much rich church history and mission history embedded in Africa and Asia, then why even more important it is that the books that have shaped how we do theology is written from one particular community. And so I decided to go on a journey that, okay, I'm going to see whether we can do some project to begin to chronicle some of the history, contemporary history in Africa. So that led me to start doing some studies around Pentecostal history in Nigeria. And I realized that actually many of that have not been really captured. So I started writing myself. So I started writing. And I started writing textbooks myself to help the Nigerian church, the African church in that sense. Why is this question important? The reason this question is important is this. I think Sue laid a very good background for us in terms of contextual theology. Those questions are very important because of contextual theology, in terms of context, who is theologizing and for whom are we theologizing? And so for me, the questions I was asking, some of them were around why is it that some of the questions I am asking, no one has written about them, or no one is asking them. And the questions that it is being posed by other people, that is being answered by other people, is answering questions from other places. So for example, just to unpack this a bit, some of the questions that were being answered in some of the theological textbooks that I was reading was actually around evolution, how our world is created. And in the African context, that's not a question, as African Christians, that's not a question we were asking. And so we are reading theological textbooks that is answering questions that were posed from other contexts. Whereas the questions we were asking as we were growing up is this: why are we suffering as Africans? In fact, someone puts it this way. He said, why is it that black people suffer so much? And that's a theological question, by the way. And so those kind of questions, no one was answering them. No one was really answering them, or they were being answered from other contexts. And so those are the kind of things I started to look into and started to study and see how we can come up with answers, not solutions, but answers to begin to help us to grapple with those questions around identity. Because the thing about theology is this: the more we know about God, the more we know about ourselves. And so it's very important. So that's the sort of first part of my study. And then after I finished my study, my plan was to be a Bible translator in Nigeria, to work for something related to Wycliffe Bible translators called Nigerian Bible Translation Trust, because I now have mastered the language of Greek and Hebrew. But then God had a different plan. I had an opportunity to be sent to the UK as a missionary. So my Pentecostal church in Nigeria sent me to the UK as a missionary to come and plant a church. But also, I also came to further my theological education. And when I came, I started observing different churches in London. I started observing different churches, and I saw that there were white majority churches, there were black majority churches, there were different flavors of black majority churches, there were African Caribbean churches, there were Ghanaian churches, there were Nigerian churches, Kenyan churches. And so I started to reflect that, okay, if I plant this Nigerian church, if I plant this church, it probably end up being a Nigerian church. So I felt, if God has called me all the way from Nigeria to be a missionary in the UK, then it defeats the whole point of it if I start leading a Nigerian church. So I abandoned the church plant and decided to look for an English church, very different from what I was used to. So I started attending a Baptist church in Southeast London at that particular time. And as I started attending this church, I started doing some youth work and etc. And it was in this church that I later now became a minister serving, and realized that later I actually became the first black minister in its 100 years history. And that quite became a pioneering role, and a role that sort of helped to realize that so many things were happening in that sense. But in that church became my placement for something. It became a placement when I learned about the multicultural and multi-ethnic dynamics of churches in the UK. So there was myself and another English lady leading a multicultural church. The church was about 60% white and 40% African Caribbean in that sense. And through that journey, I started to help other church leaders to realize that actually UK is a mission field. We are here not by accident, but God has called us here. But the question is this: if UK is now postmodern, is multicultural, it's multi-ethnic, what kind of a theology do we need to reach out in this current context? If it is postmodern, it's no longer modern, it's no longer pre-modern, it's postmodern, which simply means what you think is your truth is different from my truth. Truth is relativized as it is. And so in that context, in that secular space where people think God or the idea of God and religion is not relevant, what kind of a theology do we need to reach in that context? But added to that layer is that Britain is also pluralistic. It's also multi-faith, which also means that people have come from different parts of the world and they have come with their religion, with their ideologies and their philosophy. What kind of a theology do we need to reach out in this postmodern, multi-faith, multi-ethnic society? There are three approaches, three theological approaches. One is a cross-cultural approach. A second is a multicultural approach. And a third one is an intercultural approach. The first one, the cross-cultural approach, I think at the moment, because of many Western mission agencies, because of our focus overseas, because of that's the way we are set up, that's the way we are geared, our mission education is preparing people to go overseas, is preparing to cross the culture. But what our theological education is catching up with at the moment is that mission field over there has actually moved over here now. And the thing is this: the experience of those who have gone overseas, whilst that is valid and is important to reach out to people here, it's not enough. What do I mean by that? A Ugandan in Uganda is very different from a Ugandan in the UK. Very different. A Nigerian in Nigeria is very different from a Nigerian in the UK. The reason is this: they have crossed the frontiers, those who are here. And because they have crossed the frontiers, their experience has been altered and has been reconstructed. Now that they are here, they are going through a three-level process of surviving, existing, and flourishing. What do I mean by that? When people come here, there is the initial shock of coming into the Western world. There is the visa process and what that means for life and experiences. I've been to churches where sometimes pastors don't fully understand what the visa process looks like. Because if you have a British passport, you are likely to travel anywhere in the world without inhibition, without limitations. But if you have a Nigerian passport, there are so many things that comes with that. The process you go through at the customs. At the moment, I've got both, so I have the joy to be able to have that. But I remember in one of my travels to the UK, using my Nigerian passport, I was detained in Schiphol Airport in Amsterdam for about an hour just because of my passport. Fast forward 15 years after, I had a British passport, went through the same place, no one bat an eyelid about that. So the experience of coming as an economic migrant, which is what we have called people, or refugees, or asylum seekers, those experience is very different for someone who is living as an African in the continent of Africa. Two different experiences. For those who are living on the continent, They are in an environment, even though it might still be difficult and tough, but they are in a place where at least they are still accepted as who they are. Whereas when you cross, there are several things you are wrestling with over here. Migration issues, race issues. And so the question again is this: in our theologizing, do we have enough theology to combat racial injustice? Or is there something deficient in our theology that has not begun to address those issues? So that first approach of cross-cultural approach is not enough. The second approach, multicultural approach. And all over the UK, there are many multicultural churches at the moment. And what that simply means is that people of color are represented in our congregation. But oftentimes when we look at the leadership, it's still very different. I've been to a lot of churches where people of different nationalities are well represented in the congregation. But at the governing structure, at the leadership level, at the board level, the culture that shapes the church is still very monocultural. It's not multicultural. And so we have multicultural churches. We have multicultural approach in trying to mitigate, in trying to reach out to the internationals. And while that draws people in and welcomes people, it doesn't integrate them. Multicultural churches creates what I would describe as segregational inclusivity. What I mean by that is simply we have churches where, yes, people congregate together, but it's at that representational level. It hasn't gone to inclusion, and definitely it has not included equality. And so there's a challenge. If we're going to move beyond the second approach, we need an intercultural approach. And that's where intercultural theology comes in. And that starts with a question. And the question is this: if God has brought people from different nationalities to us, they are a gift to us. They are here for such a time as this. In a time where British churches are declining, and the churches that are actually growing are migrant churches. The churches that are growing at the moment are Hong Kong churches because of the Hong Kong migrants. There are churches that are growing from 50 to 100 to 800 to 1,000. Do you know this is happening right now? At the moment, they are growing at a phenomenal rate. And so if God has brought this gift of diversity to our shores, how do we want to ensure that we do not waste it? How do we want to ensure that this mission resource is fulfilling its potential? And that is where we need intercultural theology to reach out to the internationals. An intercultural theology that affirms the equality of everyone, that affirms the humanity of everyone, that says at the start, I am because you are. Not I think, therefore I am. Not an individual or an independence attitude, but a theology of interdependence that realizes that actually we need each other at all levels. That is the sort of theology that we need. And that is one that I've been working on with other people. And I'm so glad to see what Sue put on earlier about the shift in All Nations MA courses, reflecting some of those changes, those intercultural perspectives, because it is important. Because intercultural theology, this is what it does. It mutually inconveniences us. I am mutually inconvenienced. You are mutually inconvenienced. It's not just one person being inconvenienced. We are all inconvenienced. The best way to describe it is what Paul talks about in Ephesians chapter 2, where he talks about God created a new humanity church, a church that Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians are now creating this new humanity church in Christ. That is intercultural theology. That is the kind of theology that we need to reach out to this context. One of the hardest places to share the gospel at the moment is Europe. it is one of the toughest places to share the gospel at the moment because of our postmodern, secular, enlightenment worldview. That simply means that people are not interested in religion. People are interested in God, but not in religion. And so it's a tough. I remember meeting a Ghanaian missionary who came not too long ago, and he said, Israel, this mission field is very tough. I said, what do you mean? He said, a lot of the effort I'm putting to plant churches at the moment, he said, if I do half of those efforts in Ghana, I will be leading mega churches by now. He said, but here, all those efforts, I've only managed to reach about 50 people. I said, welcome. This is the task that we have. Welcome. This is the mission field that many of us have found ourselves in. And so as a reverse missionary, one of the things I have tried to develop in terms of theologizing is reverse missiology. And that is to help us to think about missionaries that are coming in. And as I said earlier, some of those missionaries are coming, we call them economic migrants. I prefer to call them missionary migrants because they have come, God has sent some of them here. But some have come, obviously, as asylum seekers and as refugees. But God has sent them here for a reason. And they are in our churches. And so how is our theology going to enable them to fulfill their potential? So that together, the world Christianity that is now represented in Britain will be able to reach out to the multicultural missionary society that we have at the moment. In order to do that, we need an intercultural missionary movement to reach out to this multicultural, postmodern society. It is my prayer that we're able to construct this theology together, which is still ongoing. It's not ended. It's just in its early stages, I think, to be able to see what God might do in this season. I'm going to leave it there. But if you have any questions or you want to talk to me, I'll be around. And I've got some books, as I said, that I've written around some of this stuff, around reverse mission. I'm just going to show them. If you're interested, I've got some copies here. And if you're interested to talk to me, I'll be around. Thank you very much.